of Evergreen Action, and we are going to give it just a minute to let some more folks pour in to this highly anticipated panel today, and then we will go ahead and get started. I hope everyone out there is enjoying the fabulous weather that DC is getting now. Hope it's similar across the country. Marianne, is it nice out there in West Virginia today?
It is. West Virginia is just showing off, I have to tell you, with the redbud trees and the dogwood trees, and everything is like this bright neon fresh green. It's just spectacular.
Spring definitely has its perks, doesn't it? I always think one of the reasons I naturally wanted to spend my life fighting climate change is because I hate being hot, but I do love spring. The flowers are really nice, so I'll give it that. Among all of the reasons that we all spend our life fighting the climate crisis. All right, let's give it one more minute. We are waiting on Congressman Khanna, so I want to give him a beat to jump in from the fabulous other things I'm sure he's doing today, and then we'll go ahead and get started. But if you're just tuning in, we are about to start our panel on the historic power sector standards that were just announced yesterday. And here we go, filling out our incredible panel here, Congressman Ro Khanna joining us. Very excited to have you with us. And welcome everyone in the audience. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's a beautiful day here in Washington, D.C., and we are going to go ahead and kick it off. All right. Well, thank you to our audience members from across the country, for supporters, members, partners, reporters, all you folks out there who work with Evergreen Action and help us make a difference in the world tackling the climate crisis. Thank you so much for joining us today for our panel, The Powerful Sector. We are here today with an incredible array of experts to talk about the historic pollution standards for the power sector that were just finalized yesterday from the EPA. And what a day it is. I am Lena Moffitt, the Executive Director of Evergreen Action. I'm based in Washington, D.C. If you get to chat with me in person, I use she, her pronouns, and I'm so thrilled to be talking with my friends and experts here who I will introduce in just a moment. But as I'm sure you all are, paying attention to the news and watching what the government is doing to address the climate crisis, it has been a really exciting couple of weeks. It's almost, even for us experts, really paying attention, it's almost so much it's hard to keep up with, which is really exciting. The Biden administration is in sort of a green blitz mode. Check out the thread that our digital team did a couple days ago, listing many of the top things that they have done over the past couple of weeks for Earth Week in particular. But today we're going to talk about the historic standards that they finalized, 4 of the remaining 11 standards that Evergreen and you all have been pushing for. Just yesterday at Howard University, EPA administrator announced the finalization of those. And this is really a culminating moment in many ways for fights that have been waging for a very long time. Marianne, I want to give you a shout out. You've been leading this charge for efforts to clean up the power sector for multiple decades. And these rules represent following through on commitments that the administration made to tackle pollution from the power sector, one of the dirtiest sectors in our economy, in a holistic, multi-pollutant strategy. And it was very exciting to see the administrator finalize these 4 remaining rules of the 11 we had been pushing for. So before we dive into the details and talk about what those rules mean and what lies ahead for the power sector as we work to tackle the climate crisis, I want to introduce our incredible panelists. Ro Khanna will be joining us in a moment, so I will come back to his introduction. So I will start with the illustrious Marianne Hitt, my longtime friend and I would say mentor, who is the Senior Director of U.S. Initiatives at Climate Imperative, where she helps lead the organization and oversee U.S. programs that support work to cut emissions this decade at the scale needed to address the climate crisis. Marianne has spent over 25 years of experience building and leading effective campaigns and organizations, including 12 years at the Sierra Club, where she was the national director of campaigns after working for a decade as the director of the Beyond Coal campaign, which blocked the construction of 200 proposed coal plants, secured retirements of 2/3 of existing coal plants, and inspired sister campaigns across the world. She's a contributor to the climate anthologies All We Can Save and Not Too Late, some of all of our collective favorite books, I'm sure. And she's a Public Voices Fellow of the Op-Ed Project and the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. And I am so happy to see you again twice in 1 week, Marianne. Such a pleasure seeing you. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It was an incredible day yesterday. I, as you know, got to bring my 14-year-old daughter, almost 14, for National Take Your Child to Work Day. And what a Take Your Child to Work Day, one for the ages for sure, to see those rules we've all been working for so long finalized. So thanks for having me today to talk about it all.
Of course. Thank you for joining us. And as folks, I will share with folks, I was lucky enough to work for Marianne for a long time and looked up to her for years before that. And so we're so glad to have you with us, Marianne. All right. And next we have Quentin Scott, the Federal Policy Director at CCAN, the Chesapeake Climate Action Network Fund, where he leads CCAN's 100% clean energy and climate accountability campaigns. With nearly 15 years of political experience, Quentin has built and led effective advocacy efforts at the local, state, and national levels. And using his background in math and science from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, Quentin has used data to implement transformative educational policies as chief of staff for leading Illinois state representative, to advocate for cleaner mass transit as a legislative correspondent in the U.S. House of Representatives, and consulted on numerous political campaigns. For the last 3 years at CCAN, he's taken these experiences to help lead efforts to pass the Inflation Reduction Act and implement climate justice rules at the EPA. And what an illustrious colleague you are, Quentin. It's so wonderful to see you. I have such fond memories of being in the trenches with you to get IRA passed, and it's nice to see you again today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Lena. It's great to be here. I'm glad we're taking the time to pause and acknowledge and understand these great rules that have been finalized yesterday, because it is a big deal. I'm really feeling energized. If any of these rules by itself passed in a given year, we would be taking a victory lap. But we got 4 rules all in one day. So, it really raises the bar on what we can achieve. So glad to be here. And now that I think about it, the last time I saw you, Lena, we were at the White House celebrating the 1-year anniversary of the IRA.
Hey, it's a good day when we get to see Quentin and celebrate historic climate action. I love it. Well, thank you for joining us, Quentin. Congressman Khanna, thank you so much for beaming in from, it looks like a fabulous spot somewhere else in the world where you are.
Well, I appreciate it. I really appreciate your leadership, and I appreciate your giving us Elizabeth, who's now doing incredible work for our efforts. And we were actually in Wisconsin together for a couple of days going around the state for President Biden. And one of the things that kept coming up with young voters is the excitement with the civilian conservation Civilian Climate Corps, and what President Biden has done with the 20,000 applications and jobs that are going to be open. Amazing to me that in rural Wisconsin and small towns, people were aware of this, young people, they were excited about it and really had followed it. And so I do think that is one of the things in our, of the many things that the administration has done and that all of you have worked on, that we can be very proud of, and that is going to inspire folks. That's going to be seen, in my view, eventually, like the Peace Corps or AmeriCorps, this lasting legacy of activism, and also a lot of awareness of the investments in solar and wind. Wisconsin had a lot of wind, but massive investments in geothermal, solar, wind that the IRA has spawned, and an appreciation that we've got work to do still on ending fossil fuel subsidies and making sure that we don't have new fossil fuel infrastructure being built, but they, really appreciated a lot of the work that we have done. And so I think we've got a great story on climate to tell.
That's so encouraging to hear, Congressman Khanna. Thank you for giving us an update from the campaign trail. And it's always wonderful to hear that the work you're doing is breaking through. And for folks who don't know him, Congressman Khanna is serving his 4th term representing California's 17th congressional district, beaming in, it sounds like, from Wisconsin. And Charles, I'm going to come back and introduce you after we let Congressman Khanna speak for a moment additionally, because it sounds like we may lose you here in a couple of minutes. So bear with me, Charles. We'll get right back to you. But Congressman, I'm so glad you mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act and young people and what we're seeing reflected back to you as you talk to folks across the country. The power plant standards that were finalized yesterday are historic action that this administration is taking to tackle what we think is the greatest crisis facing the planet. And I know you have prioritized climate change in your work in Congress, getting the Inflation Reduction Act passed, working on getting these resources out to communities in so many important ways, like you're seeing. And the path ahead is still really important. Why do you think that actions like these rules are so important for tackling the climate crisis and also for communities that you're out there talking to?
Well, this rule yesterday is historic and huge. I mean, it's basically going to require all of the utilities to transition to renewable energy and to upgrade their technology in terms of lowering emissions and to change their sources into renewable energy. It sets us on the path to have 100% renewable clean energy by 2035, which also, by the way, is going to mean cheaper electricity. And I think it's really important that we talk about that solar and wind and geothermal now have gotten to the point where they're actually the cheapest alternative. And it's much better than and more reliable than having to have coal or oil shipped across the state if a state does have renewables as a source of energy. And this standard is going to basically allow us to get there faster. I think when the president wins re-election, we can even expand this beyond utilities to having a clean electricity standard generally that the DOE sets and for 2035 that will incentivize and require to get to 100% clean energy. And that's sort of a great prospect for a second Biden term.
Well, we couldn't have said it better ourselves. We love a clean electricity standard here at Evergreen, and we're so glad that you're raising that. I love that optimism. So when you said when Biden wins, I like living in that world. So you think Congress is going to be back at this, huh? Setting an even higher bar?
Well, I absolutely think so. And it's not Congress. Look, I was one of the things I was proud of doing is when Manchin was holding up the entire Build Back Better. I was one of the few progressives in the room talking to him, and I kept telling him, Senator, I care about everything, but climate is the red line, and I can get and we can get the progressive and climate groups on board with even a compromise that we disagree with on some provisions if the climate investment stays. And he got that, and he understood the activism of young people. So it's not just President Biden, though he deserves credit, or Senator Schumer or Manchin coming aboard, or House progressives. It's groups like organizations like Evergreen and all of the activism that went into climate work. And that activism is only growing stronger. I was really heartened that even in rural communities in Wisconsin, climate would come up as the second or third issue after abortion rights, which was right up front, and some of the economic issues. People would bring up climate. And if that continues, or that activism continues, then politicians will be forced to react. So I think the question of what will be a Biden second term is dependent on how much we push for these issues. And if we make the clean electricity standard one of the defining fights, then I think that'll be what the president spends political capital on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Speaking as a true organizer, I love that spirit. That is fantastic. So, and talking about the Inflation Reduction Act too, we want to say thank you for your leadership in helping get that done. I remember when it was reported you were one of the congresspeople in the room with Manchin trying to get him there. So we could not be more grateful for your leadership. We'll forgive you for stealing Elizabeth from us. You've got good taste in your staff there. Are you seeing the investments from the Inflation Reduction Act and the growing clean energy as it's flowing out into places like rural Wisconsin? Are you seeing that show up in these communities? And how do you think that will help standards like the power plant standards be even more successful?
I think that it is showing up, but it's slow, like these things often are. I mean, I think that's one of our challenges from just a electoral perspective, that how do we get the story out when it takes a lot of time to have all of these investments come. But we have had quite a few battery plants across America show up. We've had electric vehicle new factories show up. We've even had clean steel in certain parts of Pennsylvania show up. And so I think all of us have to highlight, to go to these communities and highlight what the new jobs are, what the new projects are, and the difference it's making in people's lives. And I think one thing we have to keep thinking about is that, I was in Racine, near Racine, Wisconsin, which is a hard-hit town of gone from 90,000 to 70,000. And they haven't seen much yet. I mean, it's really hard in the most deindustrialized places to get some of these new activity. And so I think we have to be very intentional about how we make sure it's hitting all parts of our country.
Well, and that's one of the things about the opportunities that come with federal investments like those in the Inflation Reduction Act, helping ensure that more and more communities can benefit from this transition. And while it does take time, I think it's so great that folks like yourselves and Evergreen and CCAN and Marianne out there are talking about these investments and making sure that people recognize the policies of the Biden administration are taking us in the right direction, and that more and more folks can benefit from them because of the way they're designed too, with the requirements in there, like Justice 40, that disadvantaged communities are going to get a lot of these benefits. So thank you for being out there and highlighting these. And I'm so glad you're hearing from young folks about climate change and these issues that we're all working so hard to make a difference on.
Well, I'm deeply grateful to you, Lena, and to Evergreen, and to Charles and Quentin and Marianne. I appreciate your leadership, and let's continue to get climate at the front of the agenda, and continue on the great work that all of us have done on IRA and this new clean power rule, and work towards the clean electricity standard.
Agreed. We look forward to getting back in touch with you and carrying that forward, Congressman. So thank you for your work out there. We will say our polite goodbyes to you and let you carry on, but thank you for kicking us off on today's panel and for your leadership.
Thank you. Honored to do so. Thank you, guys.
All right, we will talk soon. Thank you, Congressman. All right, well, Charles, I am apologize. No slight to you, our resident expert here. I'm going to finish introducing our panel and we will go forth. So, of course, we have Charles Harper, Power Sector Senior Policy Lead at Evergreen, where he helps create ambitious, actionable policy roadmaps for the transition to a clean energy future. Charles has co-authored 2 of our significant reports, including a roadmap to 100% clean energy by 2035, and our Warp Speed Clean Energy, expediting permitting and equitable grid deployment without Congress. No offense, Congressman Khanna. Before coming to Evergreen, Charles advocated for wind and solar energy at the American Clean Power Association, advised states on the energy transition as a program officer at the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, NARUC, one of our old favorite acronyms, and analyzed environmental regulation at the Yale Center for Law and Policy. Charles, thank you for your patience in letting me introduce you, and we are so glad to have you with us as well.
Likewise, so excited to join this esteemed panel and talk with you all about these blockbuster new rules. Thanks.
Thanks, Charles. All right, so let's continue with our questions. Marianne, I'm going to go to you next and just say, it is so wonderful to have you joining us here today. You have been working for these standards for so long. You spent over a decade heading up the Beyond Coal campaign, one of the most successful environmental campaigns in the world, stopping over 200 coal plants, as we mentioned, and laying the groundwork for many of the standards that we saw finalized yesterday. And I do want to throw in a thank you as well to our friends at Bloomberg Philanthropies and their Beyond Carbon initiative, which I know Bloomberg was essential to the formation of the Beyond Coal campaign and has been essential to Evergreen's ability to do this work, as has Climate Imperative and your leadership. So we want to say thank you to our supporters and recognize just how long this fight has been going on. So how does it feel, Marianne, to see these rules finalized from the Biden administration yesterday?
Well, thanks again for having me. And can you hear me okay? My internet connection got a little, the little wobbly internet that gets us every once in a while. It was remarkable. It was remarkable to be in the room yesterday. I mentioned I brought my daughter coincidentally was National Take Your Child to Work Day. And I said to my daughter, who's in 8th grade, Mom has an especially exciting day at work. So let's go to Washington, D.C. and be part of seeing history in the making. And it was especially moving to me to have her there because she's the reason that I do this work. She's an 11th generation West Virginian through my husband's side of the family. And I think whether you are a parent or a grandparent, or you just are someone who knows that it's our responsibility to hand down a better world to all of our children, the future generations are a big part of the reason that these rules are so important. But it's also all of us who are here today breathing the air and drinking the water because the EPA finalized this whole suite of standards for not only climate pollution, but also air and water pollution, mercury, coal ash from coal plants. So if I could just say a couple things, I'd like to talk briefly about where we've come from, and then why these rules are so significant, and then just who I was thinking about yesterday.
Wonderful.
And
Yes,
going
please.
forward. When I started doing this work 15 years ago, we were getting half of our electricity from coal. And it was not only the biggest source of electricity in the country, but it was the biggest source of a lot of types of pollution. It was our biggest source of greenhouse gases, coal-fired power plants were, biggest source of toxic water pollution. It was creating this waste called coal ash that's like the ash in a fireplace. That was the second largest volume of solid waste in the United States after municipal garbage. Coal plants were our biggest source of mercury pollution, and they were our biggest source of sulfur dioxide pollution, which gives people heart attacks and strokes and asthma attacks. And so it was a huge challenge to tackle. And in those intervening 15 years, a lot has changed, and thanks to grassroots pressure and thanks to economic pressure from renewable energy, which is now cheaper than coal, our use of coal has reduced dramatically. Instead of getting half of our electricity from coal, it's down to about 15%. And actually this year, for the first time in history, we are on track to get more electricity from wind and solar than from coal for the first time ever. And again, it was grassroots leadership like the folks on this webinar and economic pressure from clean energy that made this happen. And yet we are still facing big problems. Coal plants may only be providing about 15% of our electricity, but they emitted 55% of the greenhouse gas emissions from the electricity sector just last year. So they're very polluting. People who live next to these facilities are still dealing with mercury and coal ash and air pollution and water pollution. And in those intervening 5 years, natural gas use for making electricity has increased, and natural gas obviously has its own problem with greenhouse gas emissions and other pollution. And it's also economically really volatile. The price goes way up and way down. And so it's not just a threat to our climate, but it's a threat to our pocketbooks. So while we have made progress, we still have a lot of work to do. And that is where these rules came in yesterday. And I know we'll hear more about the details, but they put 4 rules in place for climate, air, and water pollution from coal plants. They also put in standards for new gas power plants, new natural gas power plants, putting the first ever emission limits on those. And finally, we obviously didn't get all of the work done. The one piece that got pushed farther out is standards for existing gas plants, and those are going to be coming later this year, likely in a Biden second term. And so it was really a historic day, though, I will just say, to see all of these standards come out at once to send a clear signal that we're going to clean up our electricity sector, we're going to take care of our health, we're going to take care of our climate, we're going to continue providing global leadership. And of course, there's been some fear mongering from some of the utilities who are dragging their heels, saying that we won't be able to keep the lights on. And I want to assure you that we can, that clean energy can keep the lights on. I'll just briefly mention a new podcast episode, Dave Roberts' podcast, Volts, is on this very topic with Eric Jumon and Michelle Solomon from Energy Innovation, talking about their new report that clean energy can meet our growing electricity needs as we electrify our economy. So it was a historic moment, sending a clear signal that we are going to meet our climate goals. And these rules, in addition to the Inflation Reduction Act, are one of the most important steps we've taken as a nation to close the gap to meet our climate goals. And so the last piece who I was thinking about yesterday, I was thinking about all the people living next to coal plants who now perhaps see relief in sight from the pollution that they have been living with for decades. I was thinking about the workers in the communities who have depended on the coal industry for a long time and are maybe worried about their future. And there are elements of this rule that are really with an eye towards a fair transition for workers and communities in places where I live, like here in West Virginia. And then we have so many resources from the Inflation Reduction Act to help with a fair economic transition, and so many resources that are aimed at those workers and communities, again, in places like here in West Virginia. So I was thinking about those folks living with coal pollution. I was thinking about the folks in these industries who we want to make sure have a fair transition. And last, but most certainly not least, I was thinking about all of our partners who've worked so hard to make this happen, the grassroots folks who have moved us so far beyond coal, the local leaders, local elected officials, all of the Evergreen team and family. This moment would not have been possible without your leadership and without keeping the faith over all of these years. And we should really be proud of the progress that we are marking today.
Well, here. Thank you so much, Marianne, and congratulations to you too. I mean, really personally, you are such an inspiring leader and advocate, and I, in my own life, have been so inspired by your tenacity and your dedication in working for standards like these that can make a real difference in people's lives. So congrats to you, and thank you for your work on this.
Well, yes, and Evergreen has been a champion, so my thanks right back to you.
You taught me so much when I was just a little baby advocate starting out in this work, and I am so excited to be collaborating with you on historic rules like these. So with that, let's go to a little more detail on these historic rules. I know you all out there in the audience are wonks and you want the details. So the 4 rules that they finalized yesterday, we have the great Charles Harper to tell us a bit more about what they are. As Marianne mentioned, we had standards on carbon pollution, critically important, as we know, for tackling the climate crisis writ large, is to clean up carbon pollution from the power sector as one of the single largest sources of carbon pollution after the transportation sector, but also standards on water pollution, toxic pollution like mercury and coal ash. And so, Charles, why don't we start with the carbon pollution standards? Tell us a bit more about the details. What are they and what do they do?
Thanks, Lena. So as Marianne and you mentioned, there were 2 historic regulations finalized yesterday by EPA that regulate carbon pollution from existing coal and new gas power plants. And until yesterday, those 2 sources have never faced a single federal standard limiting their climate pollution. Most covered plants, so under those 2 categories, plants will now be required to cut their pollution by 90% by 2032. That's historic. 90% pollution reductions for the entire existing coal fleet unless plants are planning to retire. And as Marianne mentioned, these coal plants are still one of the largest sources of climate pollution in the country and a major driver of air pollution and environmental injustice. So EPA is also setting strong standards for those many proposed gas plants around the country, as we discussed. So base load plants, or those plants that run most of the year, at least 40% of the year, would similarly be required to cut their emissions by 90% by 2032. And we saw this rule proposed last year, and when it was finalized yesterday, EPA actually strengthened the rule. So that was really promising. That was really great to see. The gas rule, now the most stringent standards cover more of the gas fleet, and compliance timelines are 3 years faster. So EPA moved up the timeline and covered more plants with the most stringent standards. So EPA's rules as a whole, they set a pollution performance standard. So they choose a technology that's available to power plants to cut their emissions, and then they figure out how much emissions cuts would be possible with that technology, and then task states and power plants with achieving that new pollution level. So for these rules, that technology selected was either efficiency improvements or carbon capture and sequestration. But the rules don't require any plants to install carbon capture or any specific technology. Those states and power plants have flexibility to achieve that emissions level with any technology that achieves the same environmental benefit. So EPA's carbon standards are common sense rules. We know that utilities have many years to achieve compliance until 2032, and that lead time of 8 years will provide utilities and grid operators ample leeway to ensure reliable operation of the grid and keeping the lights on. We know that in the past, utilities and other fossil fuel companies have cried wolf about any form of environmental regulation that might require them to take account for their emissions, about pollution doomsday standards that they were in fact able to achieve at minimal cost and years ahead of schedule. So we saw that with President Obama's Clean Power Plan, which did not go into effect, but utilities met those requirements anyway, a decade ahead of schedule, just purely because of the promising economics of clean energy. So that's a little bit about the power plant standards, Lena. Happy to talk more about the other rules too.
Yeah, but let's do that. But before we get there, I just want to underscore something you said about the carbon standards, because this has been a point of a lot of interest where the EPA sets a pollution level and says, this is how much pollution you as a power plant are allowed to emit. And they base that on what's possible with carbon capture and storage. But you said something really important here, that is not required to be the path that utilities use to achieve that reduction, that states and utilities will have a lot of flexibility in how they go about meeting these standards. Did I get that right? Is there anything else you want to say on that point?
No, that's right. And that's at the direction of the Supreme Court. So folks might remember a couple years ago, there was a Supreme Court decision called West Virginia versus EPA. That was about this type of regulation. And under the Supreme Court decision, EPA needs to look to inside the fence line technologies that can be installed at a power plant to reduce emissions like carbon capture or efficiency improvements. But then states and utilities have the freedom and flexibility under the Clean Air Act to achieve that level using any technology. So EPA's standards here are based entirely on the West Virginia, the EPA Supreme Court decision and their authority under the Clean Air Act, which in fact was just reinforced by Congress. So that's how the law works. And the regulation is based purely on EPA's authority here. Congress just 2 years ago in the Inflation Reduction Act, President Biden's landmark climate law, reinforced EPA's authority here. They amended the Clean Air Act dozens of times to reassert EPA's mandate and authority to regulate power plant carbon pollution. So these regulations are technically sound and legally compliant.
Yeah, it's pretty astounding to see what the administration had to do to contort themselves into the constraints that the Supreme Court had put on them to implement this law. But it seems like they did that in a really laudable way, sort of threaded the needle here in a way that we think and hope is going to be legally durable. Thank you for that follow-up, Charles. I appreciate it. Okay, so let's get into these other three. So can you tell us a little bit more about the mercury and air toxic standard, or MATS, as folks may heard that one referred to, the wastewater standard, and the coal ash rule? And I know Marianne and Quentin, you've worked on these for a long time too, so feel free to chime in as well. But Charles, lay some details on us here.
Yes, so these three additional standards largely cover pollution from coal plants. We know that coal plants are one of the leading contributors to the climate crisis, but they also emit all sorts of air and water pollutants that harm public health and exacerbate environmental injustice. And these three rules really get at those other types of pollution, not the climate pollution that really affect public health and communities. So the first rule is the mercury and air toxic standard, which applies to mercury, arsenic, and heavy metals, other hazardous air pollutants that come from those coal power plants and sometimes oil-fired power plants. So these standards would require new technologies that are available to be installed at those coal and oil power plants. And the rules would protect people from 82 pounds of mercury, 800 tons of particulate matter, nearly 9,000 tons of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides, and 5 million tons of carbon pollution every single year. So sometimes that might not sound like a large number, but these are incredibly hazardous pollutants. No level is safe for humans, and these rules will really get at a lot of the sources of these toxics that harm people's health, including mercury and other poisons that come from coal power.
Thank you so much, Charles. I know we'll have some more questions about the details there, but I actually wanted to go back to Marianne, and you had mentioned at the top one of the pieces that was delayed, that wasn't included in the suite of rules finalized yesterday. We've read a lot about this in the news, and I know many of us were advocating for this, but the existing gas standard was not part of the package yesterday. What have we heard from EPA about that, and what do we expect?
Yes, in the draft rule that EPA proposed, they were looking at setting standards for existing gas plants too, which as we've lowered the use of coal in the electricity sector, we've dramatically expanded renewable energy, wind and solar, but we also have increased the use of gas. And as I mentioned earlier, natural gas is not only a big source of greenhouse gas emissions, but has these volatile prices that really hit our pocketbook. And some of us here in West Virginia, certainly, but elsewhere around the country, people have been seeing that in their electric bills. And so EPA had initially looked at setting standards for existing gas plants, but they decided to slow that process down, take a step back, and finalize those later this year. They're not only looking at the greenhouse gas emissions from existing gas plants, they're also looking at some of the other public health pollutants, possibly from gas plants, including nitrogen oxides and formaldehyde, which is a nasty toxin that comes out of gas plants. And so there are all the advocates who are out there, I know, including Evergreen, who worked so hard on these standards, are also rolling up their sleeves to work on the strongest possible standards we can get for pollution from existing gas plants. And, I think this is the kind of progress we can continue to make in cleaning up our electricity sector in President Biden's second term. It likely is not something that can get over the finish line in the first term. And it's very important because not only are these existing gas plants a big source of greenhouse gas pollution, they also are harmful to the health of the people who live near these facilities. And we can meet our needs for this additional electricity with renewable energy, with wind, with solar, with storage. And so anyone who wants to get involved in making your voice heard, that's one of the most important things I think people don't always understand about these EPA rules and standards, is that the public's voice really matters. The EPA takes public comment. They have public hearings. They made, as we've heard, they made changes to these rules based on what they heard from the public. They're also going to be hearing from industry. They're also going to be hearing from the utilities that want to keep building and running to forever, unabated gas plants. And so it's the grassroots folks here and all of the team Evergreen and beyond who got us to this point. And there's an opportunity here to stay involved and keep moving this progress forward.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Thank you, Marianne. And yes, Evergreen was dedicated to seeing those existing source standards included, and will be continuing to push to ensure that all corporate polluters are required to clean up their pollution, including those gas plants. And I think there are somewhere like 1,500 existing gas plants that aren't covered under this rule, and we want to make sure that they are required to rein in their pollution as well. And I'm so glad you brought in those other things that we're encouraged to see that the EPA will be considering as they look at that standard as well. Other toxins, formaldehyde, looking at things like cumulative impact. We know that, like Administrator Regan said yesterday, 70% of fossil fuel power plants in this country are in low income or communities of color. But so often are other polluting facilities. So it's not just a power plant, it's also a trash incinerator or a biochar plant, and there's a cumulative impact of multiple pollutants that can and should be considered as we look at how to clean these things up. So we look forward to working with you all and collectively raising our voices to continuing to push for those plants to be covered as well. Okay, so speaking of communities, let's move ahead. Quentin, you have worked on rules like these for so long. You've worked on policies at the local, state, and federal level. Let's talk about localities and communities. What do these rules mean for communities living near these polluting power plants, and what does the future look like under these rules for folks?
Yeah, it's a long overdue day for income communities and communities of color who disproportionately live near these fossil fuel power plants, like everyone's been saying. Actually, last year, Evergreen created a fantastic map where you can see the locations of all the coal and gas power plants. And when I looked it up for Maryland and Virginia, you may be surprised or maybe not that the largest and dirtiest power plants are near low income communities and communities of color. As Mary Ann mentioned, this fight to update these power plant standards have spanned multiple administrations. But finally, President Biden and Administrator Regan promised that they would take on the challenge on updating these standards. And they did, and they should be commended for doing that. These suite of rules are working together, are reinforcing each other, and hopefully are legally durable. But as they work together, they're going to reduce a wide range of toxic pollutants like arsenic, selenium, and other heavy metals that cause cancer, harm to kidneys, lungs, nervous system. These rules will also reduce pollution that lead to developmental delays, learning disabilities, and birth defects. And let's not forget about the lives that will be saved from premature deaths. The mercury toxic rule alone will reduce 100 pounds of mercury per year by 2028, leading to $300 million in benefits and $130 million in climate benefits. For CCAN, our top priority was actually finalizing the carbon pollution standard for power plants. We see it as the quarterback for these rules. Quick shout out to my Bears last night for drafting Caleb Williams. No pressure, but I expect a Super Bowl in the next 3 years. But the carbon pollution rule will have the biggest impact, and will have a foundation of setting a foundation for us to successfully decarbonize our economy going forward, just like the quarterback's the foundation to any football team's success. As you know, as we're talking about communities, last summer, over 1 million people submitted comments to the EPA on the carbon pollution rule. 6,000 of those comments came directly from our CCAN members, and I know that they put in their comments things about strengthening the rules. And as Mary Ann mentioned, like those comments really influence the EPA to strengthen to where they accelerated the compliance timelines. They strengthened the base load standard to cover more gas plants. Based on their own EPA's projections, 1.38 billion metric tons of carbon pollution through 2047 will be reduced, which is equivalent to 328 million gasoline-powered cars. It's also projecting $370 billion in climate and public health benefits over the next 2 decades. We're also talking about avoiding 1,200 premature deaths and preventing 57,000 lost workdays. So we're talking about economic impacts, health impacts, climate impacts. This is a major rule. This is a good day. We took a positive step in the right direction to start righting the wrongs of climate injustice for these communities that have been burdened for many decades. Are we done? Absolutely not. We have plenty of work to do. There's plenty of fights. But when we have days like yesterday, it makes our work so much more exciting. And I'm ready to get to work on the next suite of rules.
Hear, hear. I love that. Thank you so much, Quentin. And as an organizer at heart, I do think it is so important that we take time to celebrate victories when we get them. So it's really a pleasure to be here celebrating with you all and with everybody out in the audience too. We have to take these things to heart to sustain ourselves as, yes, we look to the fight ahead and continue pushing, but let's, feel good and really internalize this win that it is. And with that, bolstering our spirits, I would love to ask you all to chime in as you want to on one final question. You noted, Quentin, that we're not done and there is work ahead as we work to fully decarbonize the power sector, and then go on to electrify our whole country to tackle the climate crisis, to create good jobs as we do it, to be spreading the benefits of these solutions to more and more communities and cleaning up toxic pollution. There's a lot left to be done. So what is top of mind for you all as we look to the world ahead of us, knowing that these next few months, these next few years are so important as we work to avoid the worst of the climate crisis? Who wants to go first? All right, I'll go in order. Charles, you're off mute. Okay, go for it.
Okay, sure. So we made a lot of progress today at the federal level, but the fight really now moves to the states, to the rest of the country. So EPA's rules provide a crucial advocacy tool to reduce fossil fuel power plant pollution. And the fight now moves a lot of times to state governments and utilities who now need to make those smart decisions to invest in cleaner energy sources, and instead of fossil fuels. So every state now will be responsible for deciding how to implement these EPA rules and submitting those state plans to EPA for approval, which means that everyone who lives in the states and territories around the country can get involved in their state's own planning process and how to implement these new pollution rules, ensure that utilities are not investing in new fossil gas power plants in violation of these rules. So Duke Energy, for example, you might know that big utility company in the Southeast is right now planning 10 new gas power plants in the Carolinas, including 6 gigawatts of new baseload plants, which would be covered by the most stringent standards under these rules. So it's up to advocates really and regulators in those states who approve decisions by utilities to ensure these plans are defeated, that we're not investing in last century's fossil fuel technologies, and instead are looking to lower cost clean energy and the emissions cuts that these rules would require.
Love those details, Charles. Thank you. Anybody else have an answer on that one? What do you think about for the path ahead? What's top of mind?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Similar to Charles, top of mind for me is how do we stop utilities not going on a gas plant building spree before all these rules kick in the early 2030s. Unfortunately, not all utilities are going to look at these rules as reasons to change their business philosophies, but instead they're going to actually look at this as an opportunity to get one last build out of rate pay or boondoggles that they stand to make billions on. We've seen this before with coal plants in the 2010s, and so we need to stop that in this moment. If you don't believe me, they've already started, as Charles just talked about Duke, but Dominion Energy is also sort of doing the same thing. They proposed a 1,000 megawatt gas plant in Chesterfield, Virginia. My colleagues at CCAN here are working hard to push back on that. You would think that Dominion wouldn't even put forward such a proposal after the passing of the Clean Economy Act in 2020, which requires Dominion to be 100% renewable by 2045. You would think after the clean energy tax credits in the IRA, which we all fought hard for, and after the EPA put out their proposal even last summer on new gas plants, you would think that they wouldn't go forward, but they did. And so we're on the ground with our organizing team and our partners. We're knocking doors. We're organizing town halls in Chesterfield to educate residents on Dominion's plan. We've also noticed that in the Mid-Atlantic area, there's an increase in pipeline proposals so they can move unnatural gas to support all these gas plants. And so, CCAN, we're ramping up right now, preparing our members and our partners for this fight ahead, because certainly a lot of these utilities are going to try to, like I said, get one more opportunity to build out gas plants, to make a bunch of money before these rules kick in. And we need to make sure that we stop it, because the people who are going to be on the hook are ratepayers and taxpayers. It won't be them. And so we need to make sure that we're fighting that right now. But these rules are a big freaking deal, but the fight isn't over. And I see it as the first part of that fight actually happens in November.
Here. Yeah. And thank you, Quentin, for all of that work. I mean, I'm glad my colleagues put the CCAN sign up in the chat here. You all, we like to say Evergreen is a small group that punches above our weight. Same thing with CCAN, where you are a tiny group doing such amazing work on all of those fronts, like you mentioned, and you were there with us every step of the way on the Inflation Reduction Act. You got those state bills that you mentioned passed, and now you're there pushing Dominion to make sure that they actually adhere to that bill and the rules that were just passed. So thank you for all of that fantastic work that you all are doing at CCAN. Folks should sign up there. And Marianne, what do you see for what's top of mind for you for the path ahead?
Just a couple last thoughts, and let me echo my membership in the CCAN fan club. I see, and Quentin, you're just making me even more proud to be a member. So thanks for your great work. I can give one more. We've heard a couple great utility examples. I can give one more, which is in Michigan. One thing to remember is that now that we have these power plant rules, every state has to implement them. So every state has to do a state implementation plan. And so every single utility is going to have to state its intentions for its coal plants, for its new gas plants, and ultimately for its existing gas plants. Do they want to keep pouring money into them, keep them running, retire them? What they can't keep kicking the can down the road anymore. And this is going to happen in every single state. In Michigan, just within the past couple of years, the advocates got involved there in the utility planning process, called the Integrated Resource Plan, that got DTE, the utility there, to accelerate the retirement of a very, very big coal plant, the Monroe coal plant. They got that retirement date moved from 2040 to 2032 through advocate and grassroots involvement. They also got DTE to commit to building 4 gigawatts of new renewable energy, which is a tremendous amount, plus almost 900 megawatts of energy storage. And they got an increase in funding for energy efficiency for low income customers. And advocates were engaged in the process from the start. That's why they got those gains in that process. And those kind of processes are going to be happening everywhere now because of this standard. I would also note, we've got to have a grid that can manage all this new clean energy. And one more thing that happened yesterday is some new standards that came out from the Biden administration on using our existing transmission system, our existing power grid, and just sort of tuning it up and modernizing it so that it can move more renewable energy around more efficiently. And so there are the needs for that kind of infrastructure also that are going to be in front of us. And then ultimately, zooming way out, we have to electrify everything and power it with clean energy. And so as we move forward on these specific policy pieces in front of us on the ground, we've got all the other sectors of the economy, transportation, industry, and buildings to work on as well. And I know Evergreen will be right in the thick of all of that.
Yes, and thanks to support and collaboration with so many of you, we very much are excited about that push to electrify our power sector as the base, and then all of the other sectors so that we have clean electrons flowing through those other sectors as we electrify. And these standards are key to helping us be able to do that. And I love the concept that you all have touched on, both on advocates using their voices to engage here, both in support of these rules, as has made a huge difference, we know. And now as we look forward to working with states to implement these rules, to make sure that the utilities you mentioned, for instance, are held accountable to implementing them and to actually following these rules. So that was one of the first questions we got. I want to take 1 or 2 questions from the audience as we wrap up here. But which organizations will be educating the public and then holding industry and utilities accountable to make sure that they are complying as these rules go forth? So I know we all respectively have some plans here, but who wants to talk a little bit about that? Charles, perhaps maybe do you want to say a bit just about how states might be working there, and then how folks can engage potentially with their states and at those implementation plans to make sure utilities follow these rules?
Yeah, happy to, Lena. So these rules now go to the states for 2 years worth of implementation planning. So over the next 2 years, state governments, oftentimes the State Department of Environmental Quality or Environmental Protection, will be leading implementation of these rules and deciding how to achieve these emissions levels set by EPA. So as I mentioned, these rules provide a lot of flexibility in how that level of emissions reduction is met by the state. So the state will have full flexibility under these rules to decide whether they want to initiate a statewide trading program to deploy more clean energy to reduce overall power sector emissions in their state, or to retrofit plants with carbon capture or hydrogen technologies. There's a whole swath of options in front of them, and those decisions will all be influenced by advocates who are getting involved in the state. Marianne also mentioned integrated resource plans. So that's the long-term plans that utilities make to decide how to meet power demand and get folks the electricity they use in their homes. So those plans are likely coming up in the public utility commissions in every state around the country over the next few years, or some similar process in states. Sometimes it looks a little different, but those public utility commissions are really an undercovered but vastly important climate agency that everyone should start paying attention to, figuring out what local or state advocacy groups are in your area that you can get involved with, and make sure they're really getting into those public utility commission processes and getting involved in those decisions on whether to invest in more fossil fuels or invest in clean energy storage and energy efficiency technologies that are much cheaper and much cleaner.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Charles. And I know the groups like Evergreen and CCAN will be working to engage folks like yourself out in the audience to make sure that we are pushing for strong implementation plans to make sure that these rules are well implemented by states and utilities. Marianne, on that point, I was wondering, maybe you could close us out with a bit of hope from some of the work that you've done in the past. So we've noted that many utilities are still saying in these plans, they want to build new gas plants. They want to build new fossil fuel plants to respond to this increasing power demand that we know is coming, is a real challenge. We have all of these other options on the table. I'm curious, you've seen this before. You've seen, 10 years ago, there were a lot of utilities saying in their IRPs, they were going to build a whole bunch of coal plants. And we all collectively, the Beyond Coal campaign, you and Bruce Nilles, we all collectively stopped those, right? So you've seen this before. The sky isn't falling. Can you talk to us about some of the things you learned from the coal fights before that we could apply to these gas fights ahead?
Absolutely. And if there's anything I would hope folks could believe, is that we can do it. We can do this. And I say that because I've seen it happen so many times. When we set out to stop the construction of 200 new coal plants that were on the drawing board all around the United States, everyone thought it couldn't be done. And this network of advocates succeeded in stopping almost every single one of those new coal plants from being built. And because they weren't built, that then gave us this opportunity with the existing 530 coal plants to say, okay, we're not going to replace these with shiny new coal plants. So how do we go about starting to retire these and replace them with clean energy? Again, people said that can't be done because they're such a big source of electricity. And at that time, renewable energy wasn't yet competitive. And here we are, 2/3 of the coal plants announced to retire, and renewable energy is now cheaper. New renewable energy is now cheaper than running an existing coal plant in every single state in this country. And it's because of folks getting involved, as Charles said, in these utility commissions. And I would just, one of the things for your listeners here to note is, wherever you are, even if you are in West Virginia like I am, there is an organization that is working in your utility commission to make the voice of regular citizens heard around issues of climate change, and also around the need to accelerate clean energy and move away from fossil fuels. So it could be through Evergreen, it could be a national organization like the Sierra Club that has chapters everywhere. It could be a regional or state organization like CCAN, but there is an organization that you can get plugged into. And even if you feel like your utility commission may not be listening the way it should be to the voices of the people, you can make them listen. And I don't just say that it's out of some sort of sentimental aspiration, but because I have been in the middle of watching that happen for the last 15 years. And that is, to me, the single biggest driver that has transformed how we make electricity in this country, and has also been an example and an inspiration to folks all around the world. So find an organization to get involved. The economics are on our side. The public opinion is on our side. The urgency of the climate crisis, for better or worse, is on our side. The demand for clean air and water is certainly on our side. We have so many of the things that we need, and perhaps the only thing that's missing is you. So please find an organization or let Evergreen help you find an organization and get involved.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much, Marianne. And we absolutely will be circling back with all of you in the audience about ways that you specifically can get involved because we need your voices. And like Marianne has said, when we do this together, when people get involved and use their voices, we absolutely can do hard things. We can do these things that many will even tell us are impossible, but we can get them done, including stopping the gas plants that are being proposed by some of these intractable utilities. We can make a difference. We can stop them. The rules that were announced yesterday are historic and are going to be a huge boon in that fight to electrify everything and tackle the climate crisis. We know what needs to be done. We just need all of us together pushing for it. I just want to close out by saying thank you to our incredible panelists. It is such a pleasure and a joy to end this exciting week together with you all, celebrating here virtually as we are. And I also want to say thank you to our audience members and to the public servants at EPA who worked for a very long time on these hard, arcane rules and got a lot of pressure from the other side, asking them not to do what they did yesterday. So we're asking folks to join us in sending them a thank you card. So check out the link that my colleagues are going to put in the chat, evergreenaction.com/thank you. We're going to send a big, beautiful signed card over to our friends at the Environmental Protection Agency, asking them to keep on keeping on and to thank them for the great work that they've done. So happy Earth Week, everyone. Appreciate you all, and we will talk to you soon. Bye, folks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for a great panel. Thank you, Marianne, for joining us. Thank you, Quentin. What a pleasure to see you. Happy end of your sabbatical. All right. Bye, Charles.